Hello, welcome again. Today we're going to talk about the age of discovery. It is an interesting age because it's not just about Europe. We're going to flee Europe and go to the New World. But this is a discussion about how we get to the New World. Before we talk about the age of discovery, we need to talk about the impetus behind why these discoverers wanted to find a new world, or even more accurately, why they wanted to find a new way to the Orient. Let's take a look at this map. It shows trade zones that existed around the year 1300, perhaps into the 1400s. If you'll notice, you can see that there are some very large trade zones. For instance, one of them goes from Beijing, actually from China, central China, all the way to Constantinople. That would be the Silk Road. In addition to that, there's trading from China down through Indonesia, from Indonesia to India, from India into the Arabian Peninsula, and from the Arabian Peninsula by 2 or 3 pathways up into the Mediterranean. There's also a trading zone in West Africa, and of course several trading zones in Europe, including a major one in the Mediterranean. Well, what happened in 1453? Constantinople was lost as a trading partner to Europe. That's because it came under control of the Muslims, actually of the Turks, and they increased the difficulty of trading. They took a much higher profit and actually discouraged trade of the Europeans into the Mediterranean for a period. Well, because of that, the prices in Europe for goods shot up. And it was right at the time when Europe had started to make enough money that they could buy these luxury goods from the East. And therefore, the Europeans were most anxious to find a way to get to the Orient without going through Constantinople. Well, how could you do that? One simple way could be illustrated here on this map, and that is around Africa. Well, what country would be most likely to do that? And that country was Portugal. It was committed to sail to the Indies, and because it was the closest nation to the west coast of Africa, and because it had never been heavily involved in the European Mediterranean trade, they were anxious to find other pathways. And Portugal had become quite adept at sailing. That was because of a prince, Prince Henry the Navigator, who established a school for maritime pursuits in Portugal. They had the best compasses, astrolabes, and that's a device that's used for navigation, and the best maps, cartography. So the Portuguese really began to explore. One of the great secrets of Portuguese exploration was the development of a new kind of ship. It's called the caravel. It had a deeper draft that allowed it to go out into heavier seas like the Atlantic versus the Mediterranean. And it had lots of sails so that it could have better control over the wind and it could be propelled more quickly. Sailing around Africa proved to have some major problems. One of them is that the winds blew chiefly toward the west. That always tended to push the ships out into the Atlantic. And so the Portuguese early on discovered the secret to getting down the coast of Africa, and that was simply hug the coast, stay as close as you could. During the time of the Portuguese king, John II, and this was from 1481 to 1495, there was one of these Portuguese explorers who succeeded in coming to the Cape of Good Hope, that is the southernmost tip of Africa. His name was Bartholomew Dias. He was able to confirm by a difference in ocean color and temperature that he had left the Atlantic and had entered the Indian Ocean, but he returned, never having more than found the Cape of Good Hope. Well, at about this time, if you notice the dates, 1495 is when King John died. At about this time, a fellow who had been trained in some of the Portuguese schools approached King John and asked for permission to sail to the Orient by a different path. That man was Christopher Columbus, an Italian, but he, as I mentioned, had been in Portugal for some time. The Portuguese decided that they had a better chance of getting to the Orient by going around Africa than sailing to the west. Many people believe that Columbus was just simply crazy. The reason is not because the earth was flat or any story like that. It's really because the people knew the size of the earth. They knew that it was about 25,000 miles around at the equator. They also knew the cargo carrying capacity of these ships of the day. And frankly, the ships were so small that they would not carry enough provisions for a group to sail from Portugal or Spain around the world. And therefore they believed that Columbus was proposing something that was simply impossible. So they rejected Columbus. But remember that the Portuguese at this point had not yet rounded the Cape of Good Hope. They didn't know what was on the other side, and there were a lot of problems and questions about that. Well, a few years later, the next king, Manuel the Fortunate, panicked because Columbus, in the interim, had gone to America, had discovered a vast new territory, and the Portuguese were afraid that Columbus may actually have found a new path to the Orient, and their ideas about the size of the earth were incorrect. So they urgently needed to do something to counteract what Columbus had done. And at that point, the king went to the bravest and most adept of all of the Portuguese explorers. His name was Vasco da Gama. And about 1497, 5 years after Columbus, Vasco da Gama went around the Cape of Good Hope and sailed to India. He did this by a very clever means. Remember that the winds blow westward just below the bulge of Africa. And so what he did is he used those winds to sail westward out into mid or even further Atlantic. And then a little further south, there are some strong easterly winds. And he got into those and they whipped him back toward Africa, and he zipped around the Cape of Good Hope and was able to climb up the east coast of Africa, go over to India, trade with the people in India, got lots of goods, and sailed back by more or less the same route, and he arrived at Portugal, and he became a hero. And then they loaded him up for another trip, and he went back again. The second trip, interestingly enough, was not just a trip of exploration. He had already been there. It was a trip of conquest. He discovered that the Arabs had a strong trading relationship with India. He decided that if he was going to establish that relationship for Portugal, he would have to conquer the Arabs, and therefore his ship, loaded with ships, many of them, loaded with guns, sailed into the various ports in India and threatened to blow up the ports if he was not given preferred trading rights. The Indian princes agreed with him. They allowed him to do that. Vasco da Gama and others with him dispelled the Portuguese and more or less ended the Portuguese dominance of that trade between India and Europe. Remember, the Portuguese trade would go to Arabia and then flow up through Arabia, through Constantinople, and into the Mediterranean. Now the Portuguese were strong competitors. Well, let's take a look at what happened with Spain. Spain decided, of course, to fund Columbus. They were aware of Portugal's success in going around the Horn, but they were somewhat reluctant to spend any money on anything other than defeating the Moors. The Moors had been reduced to a small enclave in the south of Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella, who were very devout and very strong Catholics, decided that it was their godly duty to drive the Moors out of Spain. So there was a major war going in 1492, but that war concluded. The Moors left Spain, and therefore they had some funds available for other things. Columbus had terrible demands as far as they were concerned. He was to be the governor of all of the territories that he found and was to have a very substantial royalty from all of the goods that would be brought out of those territories. They turned Columbus down because they thought that his demands were excessive, perhaps even because they also thought that he was wrong in the distance. But later, some people came to Ferdinand and Isabella and convinced them to at least try Columbus and see what they could get from him. Columbus, as we know, was successful. He went over and in 1492 discovered the New World. Columbus, throughout his life, always believed that he had discovered India. He was never willing to accept the fact that he had discovered a new continent rather than India. He did become the governor of all that he discovered, and he received a royalty, but he was a terrible governor. He allowed family interests to supersede his good judgment with respect to the people who were there. And frankly, they had to remove Columbus as governor. But Columbus took 4 different trips, and on some of those he went back to try and fix things up and to be a better governor. On others, he went back just to gather riches. In the end, Columbus died not in poverty, but he certainly wasn't wealthy. And there was some embarrassment. Columbus had spent some time in jail because he was blamed for a lot of the problems that occurred in the New World. And Columbus did not end his life in glory as he had hoped. I think we should consider the life of Columbus and his vision from the standpoint of creativity. That I think can best be done by reading this selection. Let me read it to you. Read along with me. The story you have heard about Christopher Columbus was backwards. Columbus was the guy that had it wrong. There was a good reason that everyone laughed at him. Christopher Columbus wanted to sail west to Asia. It was an incredibly stupid idea. The leading navigators and scientists knew that the earth was round, but they also knew that Asia was much too far away to be reached by sailing west. 15th century boats were incapable of making the journey, as we've said before. If it hadn't been for the totally unexpected intervention of the Americas, Columbus and his crew would have died at sea, somewhere southeast of Hawaii. Columbus had all the facts wrong. But Columbus's idea, wrong as it was, did get him out of a centuries-old rut. When he was finally given the resources to test his idea, he made a brilliant discovery. It was not the discovery he wanted to make or thought he had made, but it was still important. All bad ideas are potential Chris concepts. They may not be the solution you were looking for, but they could still carry you forward to a solution that no one has even imagined. Bad ideas, or Chris concepts, are essential to developing good solutions. Innovation is rarely a direct line from problem to solution. The path to a great solution twists, turns, and doubles back. Along the way, there are many failures that are essential to developing the final solution. So, in our quest to become more creative, don't be afraid of mistakes. Don't be afraid of bad assumptions. Make them. Go forward. If they're wrong, pivot, change, do something that's different, but at least you will have made motion. You have gone forward. You would have had some success mixed with the failure. And that, this pivoting, changing, moving, is the secret to success. So can a person be creative even if their concept is wrong? Most certainly so. And many creative people have lots and lots of bad ideas to begin with. The secret is to push past those, to recognize the mistake when you see it, and then to move on to greater things. Back to history. There was an interesting situation that occurred after Columbus's journey and after the trip of Vasco da Gama. We see that both Spain and Portugal sensed that they would be fighting over the world and who had domination. They therefore went to the Pope, and they asked the Pope to draw a line of demarcation all the way around the world. Meeting in the town of Tordesillas, the Pope declared that there would be a line that went through the Atlantic Ocean and around on the backside of the world. So it, in essence, divided the world in half. The Pope declared that everything in the European side of that line, if you want to call it that, east of the line of Tordesillas, would belong to Portugal. And everything to the west and around what we now know as the Pacific Ocean would belong to Spain. Well, a couple of interesting things. The line was originally drawn so that it just barely nicked Brazil. A little later on, the Portuguese came to the Pope and asked for the line to be redrawn a little more to the west. And by doing so, they picked up a substantial portion of Brazil, and it's because of that that Brazil was a Portuguese colony. Well, if you look at the map as we see here, you'll notice that the Philippines are in the Portuguese portion of the world, even with the line drawn a little more to the west. But we also see that Japan was in the Spanish portion. Well, what's interesting is back in those days, people had a hard time figuring out east-west location. And so the Portuguese were the first to Japan, and they claimed Japan. The Spanish were the first to the Philippines, and they claimed the Philippines. So even though the line should have given Japan to the Spanish and the Philippines to the Portuguese, it actually went the other way around. It shows that these lines don't mean very much in actuality. Here we see Portuguese colonies spread all over the world, Japan, Indonesia, India, several colonies in India, and of course the east and west coasts of Africa, as well as Brazil. The Portuguese had kept many of those colonies for many, many years, and in fact the colony in China that is called Macau, they have just recently given up. Going back to Spain. Spain decided that they would really explore the territory that they had now claimed. And so they asked a Spanish sailor who was actually trained by the Portuguese to sail all the way around the world. His name was Ferdinand Magellan. So Magellan, who had already sailed around Africa and gotten as far as the Philippines, decided that he would accept the Spanish task and he would sail to the west. He went over to South America, sailed down the coast of Brazil, past Uruguay, around Argentina. He went through the Cape Horn at the south of South America, and then through what is now called the Straits of Magellan. He emerged into the Pacific Ocean and then sailed up the coast of Chile until he got up to about Peru, and then he sailed away from there and he went across the ocean. It was a terrible, terrible journey. He had no idea how large the Pacific was, or if he knew, he was inadequately prepared. His people were eating shoe leather, trying to get nourishment. They were doing anything they could. They were straining away the bugs and the water to try and drink whatever water they could find that was not salty. And his people would have died, except that he was saved by bumping into the island of Guam, just by chance. And then from Guam, he was told how to get down to the Philippines. When he got to the Philippines, he recognized the language. He actually had a servant who was from the Philippines for his first trip as a Portuguese sailor. Now he has this servant with him. The servant recognizes the language, of course, and they realize that They are now back in the Philippines. At that point, Ferdinand Magellan becomes involved in local Filipino politics, tries to help someone in a battle with a neighboring group, and he is killed in the battle. Nevertheless, his group decided that they would continue, and so the people who went with Magellan were the first to circumnavigate the world. Well, the New World was really conquered by the Spanish. There were a group of adventurers named who collectively are called conquistadores. The two most famous are, of course, Cortez, who conquered Mexico. He defeated the Aztecs by using strategy to force his men onward. Cortez sailed from Cuba to the east coast of Mexico, and there he offloaded his men and burned the ships so that they would have no way of going back to Cuba without conquering. And then he worked through Mexico, making friends with tribes that were enemies of the Aztecs, and eventually coming to Mexico City, where he captured the Aztec god king, Montezuma, and then held Montezuma ransom for gold and silver, and it proved to be a devastating blow to the Aztecs. Later, they were able to reconquer the city of Mexico City, but then other conquistadores under the direction of Cortez returned, and they retook Mexico and subjugated the Aztecs to their colonial rule. This may have happened in part because the Aztecs anticipated that a god would return. The god would be named Quetzalcoatl, and they envisioned this god as having a beard and perhaps magical or powerful means of warfare, and therefore they saw Cortez as perhaps this god, and that may have given enough of an advantage to Cortez that he was successful in his conquest. To the south, in Peru, a few years later, there was a man named Pizarro. He also came down, and instead of conquering the Aztecs, he conquered the Incas, another very powerful empire. The Incas were centered in Peru. Pizarro was smart enough to use the experience of Cortez as his guide, and therefore he was able to very quickly control and dominate the Incas and take possession of that territory. So very quickly, the Spanish were able to control large portions of Central and North America, as well as large portions of South America, and they used those areas as colonies from which they could extract precious metals and other valuable goods. Here we see a map showing the extensive territories under Spanish domination in both North, Central, and then in South America. It's interesting to think about how powerful the Spanish culture was. Let's just think for a moment about the year 1600. This is just prior to the foundation of Jamestown, the first English permanent colony in North America. At that time, there were many cities, perhaps dozens of cities throughout Spanish America, North and South, that had populations in excess of 50,000, some even as large as 100,000, and poor Jamestown had a few dozen people at most. So we can see that the sophistication of the Spanish was tremendous in comparison to what the English or the French or any other group was able to achieve in that 100 years between the time of the conquistadores and the time of the foundation of Jamestown. But let's talk about how the English and the French, that is the Northern Europeans, conquered America in their portion. They started, as I mentioned, about 100 years later, and they were they were looking for a northwest passage. They knew that the Spanish had domination over Africa, or Portuguese over Africa, and the Spanish had domination over South America. And therefore, the only way that they felt that they could get to the Orient, or the only way that they could find to bring the riches out of the New World, would be in the Northwest. They searched in the Canadian area, and later they searched the Hudson River Valley and tried to get through the Great Lakes. All of those were unsuccessful. So one of the concepts that the English had was, well, if the Spanish have got all of this gold and silver returning, let's just take it from them. So the English adopted a system called privateers. Privateers are really pirates, but the difference is that they are pirates who are recognized by a king or queen. In this case, they were recognized by Queen Elizabeth I. And one of the most notorious of these privateers was Sir Francis Drake. It is said that Sir Francis Drake and his English cohorts at one time stole the entire year's production of gold and silver and took it to England rather than took it to Spain. And that treasure was more than the entire budget for the English crown for that year. So this is substantial booty that is being grabbed by these privateers. Well, Drake was in the Atlantic, and he was trying to find ships to steal and to capture and steal their goods. And the Spanish laid in wait for him, and they found him and they took after him. Drake quickly ran from the Spanish ships, but it was close. It was difficult. The Spanish ships kept right on him. And so as he sailed south to get away from them, he realized that the only way that he would be able to free himself from their pursuit was to go through the Straits of Magellan and to go across the Pacific Ocean and around Africa and come back to England. So that's what he did. What an interesting fellow he was. By the way, Sir Francis Drake was the captain in charge of the English ships at the time of the Spanish Armada, just a few years later. And he was, at that point, knighted for his service to Queen Elizabeth. Here we see a summary then of the various trips of these discoveries. We see the Portuguese beginning with the area down the west coast of Africa. We see Diaz and then Columbus. Cabot was actually sailing for the English when he discovered Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, but that was not developed strongly until later. Then Da Gama, Columbus again. There is sailed by Americus Vespucci, for whom the Americas are named. He was sailing for Spain. And then Cabral and Columbus. Magellan in 1519. Verrazano, finally Cartier and Drake, whom I have mentioned. So you can see that the early sailings are certainly dominated by the Portuguese and the Spanish. Only later are the French and the English able to pick up any substantial exploration rights. We can now ask ourselves the question, is discovery a creative act? It was already there. You didn't invent anything by discovering it. Nevertheless, there are clever and creative things that are usually required in order to discover something. And I think, therefore, it can be considered a creative act. What were the motivations for this exploration? Certainly money, certainly glory. Later, there would be the quest to take religion to these people. Therefore, a variety of motivations, all of them perhaps worthy, some of them questionable because they don't lead to higher values. Was the discovery by Europeans good or bad for the Native Americans? Well, the Native Americans died by the millions from disease and from persecution. For them, of course, it was bad. Ultimately, the Americas are probably better off for having European influence. But then I'm a descendant of one of those Europeans, and I guess that is a slanted point of view. Later, we will see the Europeans begin a slave trade where they picked up slaves from Africa, took them to plantations in the Americas, then took raw materials to Europe, and then manufactured goods both to Africa and to America. A truly sad point in the history of Europeans, but something that we'll discuss next time or in a future lecture. Appreciate your being with me today. Thank you for discovering the New World with me. Bye-bye.